We saw that by 1865 that the 13th Amendment had been ratified by December 6th, 1865, ratified meaning it became law. It was part of the Constitution. It was ratified by enough states, which again abolished slavery in the United States. And the statistics show that one third of all people in the South now earned their long overdue freedom. But I pose the question again because we're still in this idea of Reconstruction. Slavery was abolished under law, but does that mean that an actual celebration should begin? Right? We can look at this decisive year, 1865, when the Civil War is over and slavery is abolished, and we can say, great, slavery was no longer legal. But what about does that mean again we should say, well, who cares about what happened after that? On the contrary, I think it's super important to understand what happened after that, because here's a political cartoon, One Vote Less by Thomas Nast, showing a black man attempting to vote with, clearly he was assassinated. There's vulgar writings on the wall, and it again shows us the long and history and the long and the messy chapter of Reconstruction. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I'll probably confuse myself as I go through it, but let me try to take us a little bit back in history. This is a map from 1783, from the founding of the United States, and I'm going to try to connect this to what happened eventually in the states during the Reconstruction period. Because again, this section is entitled "Slavery and States' Rights," because there was a lot of messy things going on with regards to the individual states as to what they were going to do once the 13th Amendment was passed. So if we go back to 1783, to the original founding, right, the very, very first Constitution of the United States was called the Articles of Confederation, which we saw didn't work. They changed it later on, but it gave so little power to the actual central government. The United States, with its capital in D.C. here, was formed as a country that was fearful of strong central power, and this goes back to King George III in the American Revolutionary War. And still, even by the second Constitution, the one that was passed in 1787, it was based on this idea of federalism, in which is the national government, which makes laws for the 13 states, but also, in this case in 1783, the 13 states which also make laws for themselves. The states back in 1783 were very, very fearful of a central power coming in and violating their rights. Everything leading up to the American Revolution was this list of abuses of King George III, of the British government, of the intolerable acts, all of that. So within the history of the United States Constitution, by 1787, there's this idea: we don't want the national government to infringe on states' rights. That's one of the core tenets of federalism. So if there is a law made at the federal level, it applies to all 13 states. But if there is a law applied at the state level for North Carolina, North Carolina can govern itself. Or if there's a law passed in Rhode Island, Rhode Island can govern itself. That's one of the core ideas of federalism. So if we can again try to connect this to Reconstruction. Oh yeah, but also then by 1787, there was actually more loyalties towards individual states than towards the actual country. That's why I think this map shows like all these different states and the state flags that they have. And in 1783, if you ask someone where they were from, they said, I'm from Virginia, or they said, I'm from Pennsylvania. They didn't really say I was from the United States, right? The United States was a collection of independent states that mostly governed themselves. There's kind of a connection to the European Union today. This idea of, if you meet someone and they say, hey, I'm from Germany, I'm from Poland, I'm from France, I'm from Spain. But collectively, they're part of the European Union, which is kind of a loose comparison to what happened today. But again, this idea of states have the power. So again, going back to Reconstruction, states should have the power, even though the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, which had been a central component of life in the South. Hopefully, we're not confused yet. Okay, I'm almost confused myself. But by 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, but many states saw that as a violation of their individual rights. right? Like Florida, Texas, Mississippi, something's going on there. They hadn't even ratified the amendment yet. So, here again, Florida, um, I think it was like 27 out of 36. You needed 3/4 of the states to ratify the amendment for it to go into law. And the last state, I don't remember, but Florida didn't even ratify it several years later. So, like, what's happening here when a state says, I'm not going to honor the 13th Amendment? What happens then? And there was, and this comes later on, a group of members of Congress that began to believe that the 13th Amendment, while a great success, was simply put not enough. So let me go down to a third grade level to try to explain this, right? Two themes. Rules can change, but what about hearts and minds? And also, we can learn things more than once because, here's my metaphor, okay? I had a third grade teacher, and this was her. Actually, I just pulled this from like Pinterest or something. I hope it doesn't get taken down. This was her rule list, right? And my third grade teacher, right, like she was strict. I got a detention, or I had to stay in for recess because I remember I made a bad joke about a monarch butterfly or something, right? But this was her rules. And after I got in trouble the first time, I am not going to violate her rules, right? I'm going to keep my eyes on her. I'm going to keep my mouth closed. I'm going to keep my ears listening. I'm going to keep my hands to myself, and I'm going to try as best I can to have fun, right? And if this class rule list, right, if this is the Constitution, again, I'm trying to improve my writing skills on here, the 13th Amendment was now part of the Constitution, meaning slavery is in the rule book. There is no more slavery. So again, that is in the Constitution now by 1865. It was ratified. It was the law. But what about states' rights? Will they enforce the 13th Amendment? The rules can change, but what about the hearts and minds? We might again see the 13th Amendment, this change to the rule book, as a celebration, right? Because, an eighth grade me would have said they abolished slavery. It was in the Constitution. Awesome. Great. The work is done. But what about the hearts and minds? What about these states? Are they going to adhere to the 13th Amendment? As we will see, in many instances, they did not. And we saw that in the previous chapter with some of the black codes, which were enacted. So, yes, the 13th Amendment has been passed, but all of a sudden, and I'm making this up, there's going to be a law in place in Alabama that says these 40 black men and women who have worked on this plantation, it's against the law for them to get any other kind of job. Right? Now, is that a violation of the 13th Amendment? Well, kind of, yeah. Well, it is. It's basically the same thing as slavery. And these black codes were written and they were passed in local legislatures and state legislatures, and it was really kind of this big mess. So again, the 13th Amendment just isn't quite enough. Here we saw it again with the One Vote Less by Thomas Nast. Here's another illustration of a voter suppression campaign ad. Here's a gentleman sitting and he's saying, yeah, here, come cast your vote. Here's a black man preparing to vote, but he appears to be holding a pistol, right? That is going to change the way he will act when he's sitting there with a weapon right next to him. And this is where we again go from this idea of presidential reconstruction under President Johnson the first several years, who wasn't able to do as much, to more of the congressional reconstruction, which follows with this next slide in the next video. Seeing that blacks were being persecuted in the South, Congress then decides that they were going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. There's a couple different Civil Rights Acts. This was the first one, but it would provide greater federal support for blacks in the South. Remember, Virginia can do whatever Virginia wants. Tennessee can do whatever Tennessee wants. Mississippi can do whatever Mississippi wants. But one of the things that the Civil Rights Act did was it said, you know what? No, you can't. We are going to send troops, I'm just picking states, into Tennessee to make sure that the emancipated slaves are not still working on the plantation. We're going to go to Alabama and we're going to ensure that a new regulation designed to make sure that blacks are paid is being enforced. It was passed in 1866. Now, the really cool thing about it was, at first, it doesn't sound like it's cool at first, President Johnson actually vetoed that legislation because at this point, he has started to see this issue as one that needed to be decided by the states. Arkansas should do what Arkansas wants to do. Texas should do what Texas wants to do. Florida should do what Florida wants to do. But that mentality was not going to ensure that the 13th Amendment would be upheld. That's why we shifted from presidential Reconstruction to Congressional Reconstruction. So President Johnson vetoed that act, but a group of Republicans who later became known as the Radical Republicans, Thaddeus Stevens, one of the most famous, we'll have a video on him in a little bit, helped to ensure that that was overpassed by a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate. They overrode President Johnson's veto. That was the first time in American history that ever happened before. It's supposed to be very difficult to veto, to override. Or two T's? Oh, that's bad again. Override a veto. It's supposed to be really hard. Why did I put a question mark there? Good, whatever. Anyway, yeah, so they overrode it, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 became law, meaning there's going to be federal support to help blacks who are now freed by the 13th Amendment. But next came something really important, the 14th Amendment, because again, the 13th Amendment still just isn't enough on its own. The 13th through the 15th Amendment are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. We're going to come to the 14th Amendment next, which, get rid of all the ink. Okay, it's a little bit difficult to understand at first, but it says no state, and that's the really important part, shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. That is the federal government in Washington, D.C. saying no state in the North or in the South or in the West can do anything to deprive a person of life, liberty, or property. Andrew Johnson hated this because, again, he thought it was up to the states to decide. Going back in U.S. history, the states were fearful of a federal government getting into their business. But in the post-Reconstruction, post-Civil War South, there needed to be this idea of enforcement to ensure that the 13th Amendment would be upheld, and then to ensure that newly freed blacks would have the rights. And it doesn't apply just to blacks. It will refer to immigrants, people from different ethnicities later on. No state shall deprive anyone of its right to life, liberty, or property. So if there is a suppression in South Carolina under the 14th Amendment, there can be federal intervention in that state saying, no, you need to uphold the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. So, but how did it go? We saw this in a couple of videos ago. It didn't end up very well. We had our 13th Amendment, our 14th. We're coming into our 15th, which will ensure voting rights for African Americans. But why didn't it work? And I'd leave you with just this one last question. This is the 13th Amendment in 1865, which again should be celebrated. Slavery was no longer the law of the land. This is Dr. Martin Luther King giving the famous I Have a Dream speech. Years are only important when they help us kind of contextualize what's happening. He gave this speech in 1963. Why are there 98 years between the 13th Amendment and that infamous speech that captured so many aspects of what was wrong with life in not just the South, but in much of America? Why was there still this animosity and this hate enacted among African Americans? You know, what caused the problems? To go back again, it didn't end up very well. It doesn't mean to say that there weren't successes that occurred during this time period, but it still didn't end up going really well. So again, why, you can kind of think about this. Why didn't it work? And if you think about it, you'll probably start to come up with more of the answers as we continue to explore Reconstruction.